All right, you should be getting a little live indicator there at some point.
There it goes.
All right, and we are rolling. We're in our last panel of the day for Wonder of WonderCon Day 1 with Brandon Graham. Thank you for joining us, Brandon.
Yeah, thanks for setting this up, Chad. How's your day going?
It's been an interesting day. It's been fun. It's my first day jumping into this kind of format, or really ever doing interviews.
Nice.
So it's jumped in with both feet and been off to the races with it. So far so good.
Perfect. Cool. What do you want to talk about?
I guess we can jump back and say really quick how I came across your stuff. I know it was around the same time that Nate Simpson was launching Non-Player, and Nate said to say hi. I invited him on the show, but he just didn't feel like coming on.
Exactly.
And I guess that would have been around the same time that you were starting Prophet, and I think that's what caught my eye. It just looked such a different take on the character, and from there I got sucked into Brandon Gramland and got King City and Multiple Warheads, and I was working on a comic strip at the time called Kicking with Cactus, and when I met Brandon in Austin, Texas, he was kind enough to sketch one out, and I colored it. I can show that here really quick.
Oh yeah, that was fun. I was doing a tour at that time where they were sending me to, it was with a group of comic book retailers, and they sent me to a different comic book store every day, and we did these like insanely long comic signings. It's really fun, but it was like to the point, I remember, I think it was like 5 or 6 cities in a row, and I remember like looking up on my phone at some point, like how long you could go without sleep before it started to damage you. Oh yeah, and you color, right?
Yeah, that kind of became the de facto cover for the comic strip.
Nice.
And I did this fan art of Multiple Warheads back when, the same time that book was launching. I'll go back to this here as an example of just the intricacy and character that you put into the pages is almost deceptive in a way. It on first glance it can seem kind of simple, but then you start looking into it, and it's almost like every wrinkle has its own character to it, and everything has so much life.
Thanks. Yeah, the goal is to make something that feels. It's like it's funny. I'm doing like a reread of every Tintin book right now, and I'm realizing how much that influenced me. It's probably one of the first comics I read. So it's that weird thing of like, you want every line to have purpose. Like I get really critical of work when I see it, when I'm like, people are making lines that they don't know what they mean. So it's like I always want every line to mean something, but as you do a big city scene like that, it's like all of the signs have a meaning, and all of the everything you draw, like thinking it through, I think is important. At least it's the goal. I mean, it doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes it's just kind of falls out of the pen.
And I mean, I know with every reread that I've given any of your books, there's something new that I find every time, or a pun that I didn't understand the first time that all of a sudden hits, and it's a gift that keeps on giving. For sure.
Yeah, the puns are a problem, but I'm trying to calm down on those, because I realize that sometimes it's almost like defeats. You're doing a serious story, and it's like I get caught up in wordplay all the time. It kind of, like messes with the tone a little bit.
Like speed bumps your own momentum a little bit.
A little bit, yeah. So I'm almost like thinking a lot lately about kind of what conveying mood rather than like just like hitting it with kind of a bunch of layered jokes. Because sometimes I get really into some weird. There's this genre of manga that I came across. It's called healing manga, and it's basically like made for kind of salary people that go to work every day to have something that isn't like a Dragon Ball fight scene on their off time. It's like it's Gesundheit. It's like there's this manga called like Walking Man that just like the chapters will be things like a guy in a restaurant and he heads home afterwards and starts raining and then he goes and he takes a hot bath and that's the entire comic. And it's so different from kind of what I'm used to thinking of as like a story that's been really influential.
Would you almost say meditative?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. But there's something really tactile too, like it's something like in Prophet and a lot of my work, like eating and sleeping and things that like the reader is really used to experiencing. It's like I feel like when you do that in a story, it makes when somebody like fights an alien or something feel more real because you've already been like, there's this other stuff that you actually understand as real life.
Yeah, that's one of the things I think with Prophet that really first hit me was like there's a very there's a rawness and a visceralness that you know you and Simon has captured in there that I didn't even really get that with the old Conan stuff or anything. It's quite unlike anything else I've experienced in a comic book before.
Oh, thanks.
Just
Sorry to talk over you. Were saying?
Oh, it's bound to happen with these, so no worries. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no. Yeah, working with Simon Roy and Farrell Dalrymple and Yanni Malianis and Joseph Bergen and like the whole Prophet crew was a really big deal too because it was like it was like an obligation to do what was good enough for them, and also there's a lot of kind of push back and forth on working with them. Like especially Simon Roy, he's like I kind of enjoyed how much he wouldn't put up with my bullshit on it. He would like, I'd be like, here's a story where they go to a planet and it has like space unicorns, and he was like, that's fantasy. We have to keep it. We have to think about like how actual alien races would evolve and things like that. So it kind of pushed away from what I used to in King City and Multiple Warheads and kind of forced me to think more about like kind of I guess kind of a more grounded future.
I think you were highly successful, and people who are sci-fi fans and stuff and ask me about what a good sci-fi comic is. I always push them towards Prophet because it was just, man, and the from how it began to how it ended is like organic, but also like one of the most epic curves I've ever read inside.
Thanks.
What 30 odd issues.
Yeah, 5 trades in the end. Oh yeah, and we all got, showing my arm, we all got matching Prophet tattoos.
Oh, nice.
Simon has his on his shoulder and Farrell has it on his back. And Joseph Bergen, the colorist of most of Prophet, actually tattooed this on me. And I guess
awesome.
I've got a Tintin tattoo on the other arm.
That's excellent. Well, that brings me to your neck tattoo, the elephant. My son Riot I still have a little elephant toy, and its name was Graham since the day he got it. Since I believe I was in the middle of reading King City when he got the toy. So
that's really cool.
One day I hope to have him meet you again and have you sign the elephant for him.
Yeah. I like Texas a lot. I'd like to. You guys aren't there anymore, though, right?
No, I haven't been there in 7 years, probably 6 years.
Yeah. I don't know. Did you like living down there?
I loved it. That's my favorite place I've ever lived, for sure. It was only just for family reasons that I ended up leaving. But it's a different town now. It wouldn't be the same if I went back. So
Yeah, I guess it's always. I grew up in Seattle, and I have very little interest in living there again. Just not the city I grew up in.
yeah, it's it's becoming everywhere now. So
Yeah, it was a cool.
um, do you want to talk about what you're working on now, or can you talk about what you're working on now at all?
Sure. I mean, it's one of those weird things that I was kind of figuring out with my publisher when it was gonna be announced and how it was gonna come out right before this stuff happened, and I feel like it's going to be, obviously it upsets everything, but I think that comic books is figuring out kind of how they're going to kind of come back and how things are going to be in the next year or so. Um, I think the big worries with everyone is kind of how retailers surviving, which I hope. I mean, I feel like every business is going to be hit fairly evenly. Bookstores and things like that. So my hope is that they survive as much as any place survives, which is hopefully uh, happens. But I've been working on this series for about a year and a half now, called Rain Like Hammers, and I'm doing these gigantic 40 to 60 page issues, and I'm on issue 4 right now. So they're going to come out like almost these. They're each one's the size of like a Tintin book in pages, and it's about a. It's all set in kind of a new science fiction world, and it's all about a super criminal who has to switch out his body with kind of a genetically engineered butler body on a giant planet that is a palace planet, and kind of infiltrate it while pretending to be a kind of grown help on it, and find a friend of his daughter that's been kidnapped. Um, and there's kind of a bunch of side stories. There's a story about a guy who lives in a giant walking city, just like a big city on legs, walking around on a desert planet, and he's kind of figuring out his life on that while other cities in the same planet keep getting attacked by some kind of unknown monster. And it's kind of there's this overall theme in the whole thing, which is kind of about uh, having a direction that you're planning on, and having it get upset and having to kind of rethink your life. Like the guy who switches out his body, um, he realizes that without a lot of his kind of chemicals that being a human, his personality starts to change. He starts to become a different person than he was. So it's been really fun kind of exploring that. It's always hard to describe this stuff. It's like I always joke when someone's like, "What's your comic about?" And you're like, "It's about 200 pages." It's a lot to explain.
Well, thematically, I think that is definitely apropos for this and for this weekend, and everything that's been happening with the industry. So, um, unfortunate as it may be, it sounds very timely in that aspect. So,
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, aside from coronavirus, I find life in America to be very confusing these days, and I feel like a lot of people are kind of like it's been very difficult for me to kind of get a handle on it. I imagine that a lot of people are experiencing that. And I mean, it's been interesting. I was trying to watch the new Picard show, and I was really critical of that because it's like kind of trying to comment on modern. I feel like it's losing some of what makes Star Trek so uh, kind of unique. Is it was this very positive future, and they're kind of darkening it with every new version of it. It's kind of like I think something that kind of a place that some fiction really has is like I think dark fiction is really important because it's like cathartic to be like, oh, these people fighting zombies are having a shittier life than me. They're dealing with bad problems. But I think having like a positive future and a positive outlook is really important, and especially when you're like, where's humanity going to go? And I think old Star Trek was really nice in kind of showing like what's it like when we get rid of our problems and move past that. So I don't know. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, um, like making more positive work.
That's kind of where I started coming to after a really dark period of my life about 5 years ago. And it makes you wonder like the degree of, looking back on the 90s and the turn of the century, um, with the amount of like really dark, futuristic sci-fi takes, like on some level, that's got to become a brick in the wall of manifestation, culturally.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, that's the worry, is that so much kind of dark, so much dark fiction will kind of, I think, affect people's brains, and just assuming that the future has to be negative.
yeah.
It doesn't
Yeah.
help.
That's again with your work, something that I really enjoyed was um, the whimsicality of it. Even if it was like a situation where it's nuclear winter and there's mutants, there is still a culture and an awareness to having that be treated um, like equally in a way, I guess, with the human condition, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a certain element of like when I draw something, I have to, like pages take me like 6 hours sometimes. So it's like you got to live in it. So if it's horrible, then you're just dooming yourself to just like a 6 hours of unpleasantness for that page. And so making things that are very pleasant to spend time in. I always feel like my work's very comfort based. It's like I want to make stuff that I want to spend time with. And so even if it's kind of a darker situation, it's, you want to find some kind of light in that.
Absolutely.
I look at other people's work, I'm always like, how do you do that? How do you stay in places like that and not make it, not try to make it more fun? But lots of different types of work out there.
I'm going to go back and show some of your work here. So King City was your first like wide release, correct?
Yeah, it was my first book that made it over to Image. I'd done it through a company called Tokyo Pop initially, and they published it in this kind of small paperback manga editions, and they stopped publishing their American-made books. Me and Becky Cloonan and a couple other people were over there, and I managed to get into Image with this kind of 3/4 of the way finished book, and so it kind of helped me out a lot just to show up there and be like, here's 400 pages of this thing I'm working on. But it's a really fun series to do. The cover for the trade.
Has any trying to think how to word this. Have you been approached or pursued at all about adapting King City or Multiple Warheads into animation or anything like that?
A little bit with King City. Mostly it's been Prophet stuff. And I think there's some Prophet movie in the works right now that has very little to do with me, that Liefeld's putting together. I think it's going to be more based on his stuff. But yeah, there's a guy, there's like a film company out of Seattle that does really cool like music videos and things. I feel like they're called King City, or it's based off of something in my work, because they sent some of the stuff and I really liked it. I think they're still kind of getting to the place that they can do more stuff. But yeah, I haven't had too much luck. I made a science fiction pilot at one point called Emperor of the Known Universe, and me and the director co-wrote it, and we got a budget to make it. It was actually the weird situation. The director mostly makes porn movies, so the film crew was all kind of adult performers, and all the actors are adult performers, but it was kind of Doctor Who style.
That's Woodrocker, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and April O'Neil and Tommy Pistol started it, and
Mhm.
yeah, hopefully we'll get it out sometime soon. I was actually talking to him, just I keep in touch with the Leroy, the Wood Rocket director, a lot, and we were talking about kind of taking the thing we've made and moving it to a uh, to making like a movie version of it, because it's like 20 minutes, and I'm really happy with it. Hopefully, it can get out at some point.
Yeah, I was actually gonna ask about the Wood Rocket stuff anyway, so you answered that.
At least
Um,
it's always weird to be like, "Oh, you like my comics? I've also worked in porn," But I had a really good experience with those guys, and I'm still working with them. I'm talking to them about publishing some of my adult comics as part of their comics imprint that they're working on.
well, yeah, I was gonna parlay to that subject with that. Um, that's I've been assembling my own um, book of erotic art for several years. I think when I'm 40, in a couple of years, I'll probably put something out. I've noticed maybe it's just because of social media, it's easier to pay more attention to it, but it seems like there's been a big upswing in erotic artists. Recently there was the book with Kim Young Gi and several. I think the name of it was just erotic or something, wasn't it? It was kickstarted not long ago.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it seems like there's less of it in comic stores, and it's more kind of circumventing that because of the internet, and people are kind of doing their own. Like I'm always digging around for old comic book stuff. I went into a local comic store in Portland, and I was asking about like if they had any like. I was looking for old Italian like Eros comics. There's a series called Ramba. It's about this like assassin lady, and the guy was like, "Yeah, we got rid of all the adult stuff here before," and it was like, it's like a lot of comic stores just don't even deal with that, which is interesting because in the 90s when I kind of broke into comics, that was how companies like Fantagraphics that did kind of more arty comics, they would fund themselves by doing adult work, and I just think that stuff's fun. So it's I was I was talking to my girlfriend today about she was watching the Rivendell Archie TV show, and I was talking about how I liked that Dan DeCarlo, one of the original Archie artists, would also draw like commissions of porn of the Archie characters, because I was like, how you not? If you're that guy that drew Betty and Veronica at first, like how do you not just draw them naked sometimes? It makes it more relatable as a human being.
Have to for levity at that point. That's it's interesting, as a freelancer, some of the highest paying jobs I've taken have been, um, erotically based. Um, and I've been going back and forth on whether, like, do I want to create a pen name to separate it from other work and how to treat it. And it's just an interesting kind of conversation
Yeah, that's a big.
that people don't seem to be having a lot.
Yeah, it's weird. I did because I've done like I worked at Adventure Time a little bit at the children's show, and I did the adult stuff under my own name, and it is weird because I feel like I have had a lot of weird bumped up events. It's like people don't always like drawing naked other people drawing naked stuff, and there's always going to be people kind of pushing back against that. Um, but I think on a very reasonable level, that stuff is just silly. So it's like it's good to just kind of go forward and do what you want to do.
Yeah. Well, then there you mentioned Adventure Time too. I was going to ask a little about that.
Oh, sure. And there's a new
I,
show in Ward next very soon. It's going to be on Netflix. It looks very cool. He's the Adventure Time creator.
yeah. I remember. Did you have anything to do preliminarily with Steven Universe?
Oh no, I can explain a lot about it. I lived in New York in the early 2000s, and I was part of this comic book group called Meat House. It was started by Chris McDonnell, who worked for Ralph Bakshi a lot later on, and Farrell Dalrymple. on War and worked on Prophet and things like that. And a lot of artists like Becky Cloonan and Dash Shaw and people like that were involved. One of the major people is this guy Tom Herpick, um, who was one of the, I think he's boarded more Adventure Time episodes than anyone else. And he was a very big influence on me when we were in our 20s. And me and him had a job. We worked for, what's that company now? The Spumco, the Ren and Stimpy, the Ren and Stimpy briefly. And our job was to basically come up with cartoon show pitches, and that never got picked up. I was talking about how it was like one of my favorite jobs I've ever had. I saw him in LA a couple years ago. He was like, they didn't pay us. You know, it's like none of our jobs, none of our ideas sold, so they never paid us for any of them. It was just like all on spec. But I'd forgotten that part of it. I just remembered how much fun it was working with him. But Rebecca Sugar, who started Steven Universe, was also very influenced by Tom. And I visited the Steven Universe office, and I know some of those people. But yeah, I've actually only watched a couple episodes. Seems like really good stuff.
Yeah, I just remember wondering really early on, because I knew you had kind of a connection with Pendleton, and there was kind of some crossover there as far as I understood. And it was just like so many little mannerisms kind of in there where I was like, man, Brandon had to have worked on this show, but that explains kind of, I guess, why.
Yeah, and I think there's just kind of that era of cartoonists that they pull from Adventure Time and Steven Universe, very much kind of what I come from. Like I know Lamar Abrams worked on that one a lot, and he's very much kind of peer to like Corey Lewis, who did Shark Knife. Like Lamar has one comic that I always think about whenever I bring up his name, which is a skeleton dies and the guy goes up to the skeleton and closes his eyes that aren't there. So it's like his empty holes in his face and he closes them. And I always thought that was such a brilliant comic book trick. Yeah, there's a comic book, if you haven't seen it, called Morning Star by a guy named Kazimir Stupchak. And he's, I think for a living, he actually works in Nintendo up in Redmond, Washington, like tests video games. But he put out these like little square books called Morning Star. And before Adventure Time, they felt like Adventure Time. They were like these very innovative, post-apocalyptic fantasy comics. And it's funny, a friend of mine read them for the first time recently, and he was like, oh, they're so influenced by Adventure Time, even though that they existed long before that. I think a lot of what Pen War did was kind of bring in a lot of stuff that was kind of brewing in comic books already and kind of solidify it into one cool big storyline.
No, it's been absolutely brilliant, I think, just in the amount of audience breakthrough it's had.
Yeah, it's very influential. It's I even feel like it had some weird side effects in indie comics where I think indie comics is very very kind of based on its history. So you have like a lot of people that kind of grew out of the underground comics and Robert Crumb and Spain Rodriguez and those guys becoming kind of the 90s indie comics. And then in like 2010s or so, you get all this influx of people that just watched Steven Universe and Adventure Time and started making indie comics with such a disconnection from the underground 60s stuff. And so it was almost very much like a clash of two very different dichotomies. It's super interesting. You know, different worldviews in a lot of ways too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've just been really surprised by my own kids and friends with kids from all different age groups, from 3 to my age, the range of people that have just absolutely fallen in love with it. And
nice.
It's been very impressive.
Very universal work.
I had a Island. I'll use that to jump to Island.
Oh yeah, Island was an anthology magazine that I edited through Image. That cover was by my ex-wife actually, who did the same. She did a cover of the first cover of Prophet as well. Marion Churchland. She did a book called Beast that Image put out, and another one called The Hom. Yeah, it's such a cool illustration by her. But yeah, Island. I think we made about 14 issues of it, and kind of ran it into debt, unfortunately, but it was kind of a nice excuse to bring in different cartoonists and give them a good image page rate and try out some things. And some of the Prophet guys like Simon Roy did their own stuff, and Malachi Ward and Matt Sheehan did this book there called Ancestor, which is probably one of my favorite comics that's come out in the last decade. It's like kind of a post-humanist science fiction story. Yeah, Island was kind of an experiment that I regard as kind of a failure, but it was worth attempting, if that makes sense.
I absolutely loved it. I highly recommend it to anybody who wants to go track it down. It's I've been waiting for an anthology book that was like it, something along those lines to come out from Image for a long time, and I was super excited when it did, and it was on my pull list every time it came out. So,
I mean, Image is weird because Image's basic model is like you give creators control of stuff with this publishing kind of setup behind it, and so for the most part, it's not set up for anthologies or things like that because so much of the money's back end that it's hard to kind of put the infrastructure or something like that together. Things like Prophet or Island are very different from what they normally are set up to do. But it's cool that they're willing to take a chance, and I think Eric Stevenson is very open to doing cool, fun stuff over there. He's been a big advocate of my work, certainly. I spent the last year kind of talking to him a lot about kind of where comics are going, what to do next, and very interested in how things are going to change in the next year.
I am as well. It's interesting times indeed.
Yeah, hopefully it's
I don't
a good thing in the long run if people can survive it okay.
Greg Ruth and I were talking about how it's because of the books he's been doing. He's been more in the actual book market side, where he doesn't really have to deal with traditional comic publishing so much anymore.
Sure.
And he feels that, especially with some of the handshake deals that are being made right now to try and keep things going a little bit with Random House and Penguin and those companies, that's going to be kind of the direction they're going. And he doesn't expect Diamond to retain its hold on things after this.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of wish the best for everything. My hope is things will get trimmed down at least, because I mean, if retailers can survive and publishers can find more inroads to finding people to buy comics, that would be ideal. Yeah, I think it's kind of a nicely open time where people are very excited about new ideas and fun things. It's just about creators kind of stepping up and doing exciting, fun work, hopefully. I mean, when this is all over, I think it's such a weird, scary time because nobody kind of knows how long things are going to go on for and kind of what the overall effects are going to be.
Yeah, I think we're definitely seeing, the artists and musicians hunkering down and bringing their A game. And I think it's a really exciting time for art. I think there's going to be some really potent stories and comics to come out of all of this.
Yeah, I think it's certainly something interesting to process. It's kind of, I've heard there's certainly people that are having a hard time working now because of just how weird it is. But it's for me, it's been really effective to just kind of almost be like locked in a bunker to have to think things through and have to work a lot. So I've been staying on a strict schedule and like working every day and getting stuff done. I can show you some of actually, because I'm reading through all the Tintins, I've been doing these bookmarks for a local comic store of different Tintin characters. Got one of the shark.
That shark is awesome.
Let's see, and I have some pages from, I don't know if this shows up too well, but this is how big I work, 11 by 17 pages. Yeah, and I've been kind of just trying to do I'm still only, I'd like to be faster. I'm doing about 4 or 5 pages a week on a good week. And then I'm trying to do illustration work on the side, and I'm going to start doing a little bit of film storyboarding soon. Yeah, and hopefully when Wood Rocket starts up again, I'll start doing more stuff with them.
I'm going to be doing some more transitioning into film this summer, and hopefully kind of piece together a little short film through the fall. Something where I can have visuals and apply music and create an environment that way.
Every time I work outside of comics, I'm always amazed at how skills that I'm very comfortable using in comic books don't necessarily translate to other things. Like whenever I've done like animation work, it's like such a different animal. I'm always like, oh, I know how to tell a story, and then doing storyboards, it's like it feels like it reminds me. I broke my back when I was a teenager and had to go through physical therapy and learn how to walk again, and it feels like that. I switch mediums. As dramatic as that sounds.
It's an interesting comparison. I did storyboard work for several years with various companies, and
Did you like it?
I liked it enough that I'd do it again. There was definitely certain jobs that were a grind more than others, but I it was definitely a lot more relaxed than doing freelance comic work on a deadline. I'll tell you that.
Yeah. Nice thing about storyboards is they can be kind of a stepping stone for the next person to kind of film off of it and everything. And there's something great and horrible about comics is that the lines you make are the lines that people see.
Mm.
I think about that a lot, just doing some, you draw like a penis on the side of a building in a comic panel, and just imagine like the printer running off thousands of them.
Again, it's the levity of it is, I guess, what you need sometimes just to keep yourself from overthinking it.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, it's like there's so much stuff, I'm sure you've experienced just in doing artwork full time that requires you to find ways to keep it fun. Like I always say that like my job is not drawing as much as just like finding ways to be excited about drawing, because it's like it can be a drudge if you like anything can become a job. So it's like this finding ways to a friend of mine always described it as like he was like a looking for different fuel sources all the time, like different ways to be excited about stuff. It's weird. The older I've gotten, the more there's things that would have bored me to tears when I was 20 that now I like really get excited and look forward to. Like if I can like find an audiobook to listen to and just draw rocks and trees all day, it's really nice to.
Yeah, it does become almost a meditative kind of state.
Yeah, and that was always the kind of a frustration about doing writing for a living when I was doing Profit, is like there's none of that just kind of coasting. It's like you have to be thinking, like your job is thinking, and that became it's kind of more stressful than illustrating something.
Yeah, I found that I'll get into a zone where I try and pay attention and like try and get up and stretch and move around like every hour and a half or so when I'm really working on something. But the times when I get sucked in and all of a sudden 4 or 5 hours have gone by.
Oh,
and,
sure.
You break out of it. It almost feels like a hallucinatory state. It's almost like coming down off mushrooms or something. The feeling of it.
Yeah, very much so. It's and it's kind of it's so important to even be able to get into that headspace too. Yeah, like I was working last night, and I normally stay up to like 4 a.m. every day is kind of my goal. And last night at like midnight, I was like, I'm not going to do any good work tonight. I just went to sleep so I could wake up early and try again. It's almost like admitting defeat earlier before wasting time when not being in the right headspace.
Yeah, I've definitely, tried to push myself on some things like that when I knew I shouldn't have, and ruined what otherwise probably would have been a decent piece. But
Yeah, yeah, that's very frustrating. Although right now is a weirdly unique time where I kind of feel like I'm able to, as long as I keep slow and steady on the stuff I'm working on, I can kind of be a little bit more um, precious about my days, like making sure every drawing is something I'm very happy with.
yeah, that's something that I'm working on moving towards right now. Just finding that preciousness in every job, because there has been a lot of stuff that unfortunately I'm not proud of it, and I've just kind of had to crap it out there. But
Yeah, it's a weird mix too, because it's like you still have to do the job, so it's like
yeah,
you can't be so precious about work sometimes that you don't like forgive yourself and be like, sometimes I'll look at old work I've done and think I could do better, but that was the best I could do right then. And and that's one of the things that's important to me, like why schedules are important, is that it, like if I make myself do a certain amount of pages in a week, then it's does kind of stop me from being super precious to the point that nothing ever gets done.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's the Jake Parker, the finish not perfect
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
phrase. That I really took that to heart, and that's how I finished the book I did finally finish. It
Uh-huh.
was kind of just by detaching and realizing, you know what, I'm not going to be Travis Charest ever,
And
you
Travis
know.
probably to calm down and crack up more
you
sense,
know,
because I bet what looks unfinished or not as good for him is better than everything else out there.
yeah, yeah. It's just a matter of letting go of that and realizing that I don't need to be that. I just need to be the best me. And
Yeah, and it's worth kind of getting the thing done and learning from it and making your next thing better.
right. And that's where I'm at now. So
Nice. Yeah, it's been interesting. One of the things I'm getting out of reading Tintin lately is reading about how much he, because he had this one book that he worked on for the majority of his life, and he did some of the books he did like 3 versions of. Um, and he did things where it was like, like he had a lot of stuff with like depicting other cultures, where one of his early books kind of fell out of print because it was like him in the 1930s in Belgium being like, let me just draw a comic about Africa, and knowing nothing about it and just going off of stereotypes. And then when he hit doing a book about China, he actually became friends with a Chinese sculptor that kind of walked him through the stuff and was like, this is how Chinese culture actually is, so you don't just make it up. And I was just reading about how much he learned from that, and how he would go back and correct his work. And he actually got to the point where he had a whole studio of guys that would go in and help him like finish and color his work and work on backgrounds and things. But that kind of mentality of like having it done and then being like, if I want to, I'll go back and fix that later, I think is nice to learn about. Like allowing for improvement. I think not being perfect is something that we have to be because we're people.
yeah, well, absolutely. Well, it's the best creators, regardless of what the art form is, are people who have, kind of failed upwards. Um,
Like failing better.
well, kind of, yeah, and it's part of that grind and that struggle to get there. Um, you were basically drawing comics for 15 years before you, or more, before you really had your first comic, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
I've joked about how if I told myself it, because I got published when I was 19, and I didn't live off of comics until I was 30. And I've joked before about if I told myself at 19, I probably would have quit. And that's, there's people with much longer, there's people that are amazing artists their entire lives and never see any success that they actually do. It's bizarre. It's, John Arcudi was the writer of BPRD and Rumble and a bunch of other fantastic stuff, was telling me about Herman Melville recently, and about how like his book Moby Dick just wasn't, like, he didn't see it hit in the way that it did. Like, it's such a cultural phenomenon while he was alive. It's very bizarre to think about something like that is such a touchstone for so many people, and the person that did it is just like, oh, people like this, never sees it.
Largely, that's kind of an exception to the rule when it does. And it's something that's probably, almost exclusive to our lifetimes, when somebody's able to actually see a piece of art or music or something they've done actually shift culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe Rockwell might have been like maybe one of the first that actually, while he was alive, got to see a consistent kind of influence on pop culture. Salvador Dali, maybe.
But yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of big name artists that kind of, and there's so many people that were gigantic in their time, and kind of people lose interest in them. Like, people don't talk about certain artists past their lifetime, or become something different than what you expect it to be.
Yeah.
But so much of that is just like, it's almost like other people's business. You know what I mean? It's like,
yeah.
It's like, it almost has to be about a relationship between the artist and their work. And hopefully it's amazing when you make a living off of it, but also it's just like, it's like I was saying about spending 6 hours on a page and hundreds of hours on a book. It's like, it kind of has to do something for you, because if you're not enjoying it, then it kind of doesn't matter if it hits or misses with other people, because you're the one that like, nobody is ever going to spend as much time with a drawing as you do.
Right. That's something I talked with Greg Rutherley about too, because he's such a huge level name as an illustrator, in the industry right now, that a lot of people don't realize that the only reason somebody like that would ever spend their time working on comics is because they absolutely love it.
Yeah. And I think it's weird. I've made probably more money on comics than most other things I've worked on, but most other things with the same skill set obviously pay better, and have a larger audience.
Yeah.
But it's weird. It's like, I think one of the great things about comics is you can get, like, mass media, I think, is much more accessible for most people, but with something where it's one or two people making a book, I think it being singular becomes kind of more important. Like, you do something that's more weird and rare in your worldview. So it's like, it might never be something that makes it to like a movie theater, but it can be something that somebody who doesn't connect with every Marvel movie but is looking for something to connect to can find for themselves. It's almost like, I think about that, and I used to think of commercial success as almost like a failure, if that makes any sense. Like, it took me a while to like Miyazaki, because I thought his stuff was so universal that it was like a compromise, but then I realized that he's such a good artist that he was capable of taking his personal experience and making it feel universal. Which is interesting, because he has such a reputation as such a gruff, difficult human. I got on a whole thing with a director friend of mine who was he's making animated, I think he mostly worked in video games, guy Kevin Hanna, and he was complaining about Miyazaki seeming like a jerk, and I was like, well, maybe has to be that way to make movies that are as good as he makes,
Well, and yeah, he's responsible for dozens and dozens and dozens of people's careers, and
that's a nice thing about comics too. You can just be, I mean, it's still everyone's, and maybe that's something that kind of the Corbin stuff is really bringing out, is how connected every human being is. Like you're this massive earth, we're all kind of tied to each other in ways that we can't really, well, I don't always really think about. And even in a level of something like comic books, you have a thing where something the image publisher has talked to me a lot about, how it's the reason that it's important to hit deadlines and get out work when you say it's going to come out is that you have people at the company and then people at the comic stores and then printers and things like that, whose livelihoods and families and everything get tied to your work. It's interesting to think about, and kind of has kind of affected my process a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. It's easy to get lost in the vacuum of, creating in isolation, to realize that in the production process, there's a lot of other people along that chain that depend on.
Yeah, and I mean, granted, that's a certain type of comics. You can obviously do a comic book and put it up on a website and just have it be you and the reader, which is nice too. I certainly have to do with things sometimes where I have to kind of forget that there's an outside world and that anyone will ever see something for me to work with some days, because it can be a lot to think that that other people will be affected by work or even experience it. It's like you're drawing a picture and like, I got to show this to someone. Jesus, a lot of pressure.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of potentially good artists out there that's exactly what stops them from achieving, is the fear of somebody. I've never really, even when I put up a bad piece of art, rarely does anybody say so. And especially in the comics community, I think by and large, everyone's way more supportive than they are downers. When it comes to that kind of thing, it's a high tide raises all ships kind of industry, and I appreciate that.
I was joking the other day with someone where they're talking about how like the phrase like you're always your worst critic, but then it's just like, not until you Google your name, then you'll find people are just like especially if you put out a big body of work, you can easily find people that just like hate what you do, which is very, very fascinating. Alan Moore wrote an interesting thing about how the kind of perception of him and how it's gone past him as a person, how people just see him as a character. It was really interesting. Just because someone like Alan Moore I don't think of as a person. I'm like, oh, he's a wizard that writes comics, right? But
a lot of people do. It does become the cart pulling the horse at a certain point when you have a very strong personality that way.
Yeah, certainly. Something I think about a lot is artists that kind of have the ability to convey it's really important to me to kind of convey my personality through my work. And there's a lot of people who are fantastic illustrators who kind of, it's almost like staying apolitical in their work. They manage to not convey a lot of their, like I think Frank Quietly might be an example, or Stuart Immonen or someone, people who are very good storytellers, but they kind of, because of their collaborative processes and things, you kind of don't really know much about their personalities past kind of how they tell a story. I don't know if that's good or bad. I think it's just interesting.
No, it is interesting. On the other side of that, I think somebody like Sean Gordon Murphy, where you really see a lot of his personality coming through, even though it is a corporate kind of enterprise.
Yeah, I think that's impressive. It's funny. I've got a friend of mine who knows Sean was talking about. There was a group of people that were talking about the other day, and somebody was like, "He's a shy guy," and I was like, do you not know what we're talking about? He wears motorcycle riding gloves to draw his Batman comics. I don't think he's a wallflower. But yeah, that is impressive. Or someone like Paul Pope, who can even do a Batman comic and has like he brings like a almost a class to it.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to. I wonder what kind of stylistic changes somebody like Frank Whiteley would have if they were to do a personal work, that they had written or co-written.
Yeah, I think he'd done some early work in England that was all him. And I years and years ago, I emailed back and forth with him briefly, and he was talking about how he was uh, planning on doing personal work there, but I think it probably just got washed away by. I think a guy like that gets offered some very exciting deals, and it's hard
Yeah,
for him to take time away from that stuff.
well, it's always a treat, even no matter what he puts out. He is a massive talent. So.
Yeah, he's an interesting thing. Something I was thinking the other day about something that I really kind of regret about modern, or something that I'm frustrated about modern comics, is there's not really things that come out where every like I was thinking about in the 90s and 80s when a Frank Miller comic came out, like everybody would buy that Frank Miller comic, whether it's indie or mainstream people. And it was kind of just universally excited about it. And I don't think there's books that exist quite that way anymore. I mean, maybe the Quietly might be one of the exceptions, because when he puts out a new book, it's definitely an event.
Yeah, it is. I remember I want to say Jupiter's Children, when it came out, I was seeing uh, copies of that pop up in places where I hadn't seen, comics in a long time.
Nice, yeah. I think there's a bit of that. I think I was really fascinated by Raphael Grandpa's career, because he's a guy who's essentially done 2 comic books and has like everybody's attention. I didn't like the writing too much in the new Batman thing, but it was still like exciting to go to the store and wait for it, and it's certainly a very beautiful book.
Yeah, absolutely love Raphael's art. A lot of personality in that, and he's definitely putting his own spin on kind of everything that he touches.
Yeah, and I definitely, it seems like he might be somebody who got kind of wooed out of comic books by by advertising work, or kind of wanting to reach a larger audience, which is too bad for us. But yeah, it's nice when he does show up and do work. Are you reading a lot of new things that are coming out these days?
I'm basically limited to digital and what I order, so it's unfortunately very hard just like go in and get the chance to just flip through something and get taken by the magic of it. And that's my favorite thing in the world, going into the comic shop and just flipping through stuff until you find something where it's just like, yep, buying it right now.
Yeah, that is a very unique feeling. I think that's a kind of I just agreed this morning to do a comic book for kind of a benefit book to keep comic shops going. I don't even know if it has a name or anything yet, but they were telling me that the theme is kind of helping other people, and I was already too sold on the idea of like, I just want to try to do a comic book about the feeling of what it's like to go into a good comic store. There's a local place called Cosmic Monkey here, and they have just a separate room of nothing but back issues, and I'll always go into this section that's just like they'll just have like a miscellaneous, and it's just like comics that aren't kind of worth them categorizing because there's not enough of them, and just going through that, and there'll be things that I've never heard of before. I just got a comic book recently called Vanity. Have you ever heard of that thing?
No.
It's from 1983. I think I can't remember the publisher. Basically it's about a cave woman who finds a spaceship and is traveling around in space, and it's kind of very. It was by the I'll screw up his last name, but Will M. something, who did the DNA Agent series that Dave Stevens did a really good cover for.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so the artist did that, and he worked on a thing called Exo Squad. That was a cartoon I grew up on as well.
I remember that.
Yeah, but like
Had some of the toys.
nice. Yeah, that was a really fun thing. But yeah, just him doing like a Cave Woman in Space kind of Barbarella cheesecake comic that I'd never heard of before, because my memory of comics in 1983 is very limited.
Mine too. I was one. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I was a little old. I was probably buying comics in '83. Do you remember the first comics that you bought, or were first you read that you were given to you?
My first exposure was like the Jose Garcia Lopez stuff, like the Super Friends stuff.
Oh wow.
So like that's when I first like fell in love with superheroes. The very first comic I bought myself was Action Comics Annual #1 by Art Adams in '87 or '88.
Just Garcia Lopez and Art Adams. It's just like just the best guys first. Nice.
Yeah, I mean,
I remember.
I was hooked.
Nice. Yeah, Arthur Adams is really fascinating. I was talking about him the other day. He's probably the only artist I can think of that there's a book that is like the Arthur Adams, that New Mutants annual or whatever it was, where they go to Asgard.
Oh yeah.
And it's like the Arthur. It's like if you own an Arthur Adams comic, get that one. I guess with Grandpa, it's Mesmo, but yeah, he's got 2 books. So what are you gonna do?
I have I still have that Action Comics I got. The first one I got that signed by Art.
Oh, nice.
I have a Long Shot. They did a little sketch in for me, and the Gumby special.
Oh, that's a really fun one. I think that one was written by Bob Burden, the Flaming Carrot.
Yes, yes, sir. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, who the Mystery Men movie was based off his stuff.
Correct.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
And who did Sam and Max?
Oh yeah, I forget that guy's name. That was a fantastic series as well. I got into Sam and Max because Adam Warren would always put nods to them in his Dirty Pair comic.
Yeah, I remember the Lucasfilm games. Is how I got into it. I found out it was a comic, and I was like, "Wait, what?"
Yeah, I remember the joke. They were making a joke in there because it was like Sam and Max were like a rabbit and the dog wore like a suit, and he'd do like a really out there hilarious jokes, and sometimes the characters would get each other's names wrong. He'd be like, "Sam, I mean Max," like while talking to the other guy. Yeah, it was really brilliant stuff. I met him super. I remember I used to go to San Diego in the early 2000s, and I remember just being in this gigantic room and being like, if I can think of a comic artist whose work I love, I bet I can find them in this room. And I went out looking for the Sam and Max guy and found him. That was so long ago that Brian O'Malley was there before he got published. And I have a drawing of him with a Sharpie of a goth girl crying, and it says, "Nice meeting you" and shit, that I held up.
Yeah, I went in 2004, and it was super overwhelming. I have no desire to do San Diego again unless I'm, kind of sponsored to be there.
Yeah, it's very, very much my feelings. It's kind of. We were talking about your signed Arthur Adams thing. It was reminding me one of my kind of most prized possessions is I got to go to Italy and meet Milo Manara, and I brought over a copy of my copy of Butterscotch that Heroes Comics over here published, and got him to draw a picture of the main character in the front of it. And that was a weird thing because it's one of my most precious things, but I still like carry it out to coffee shops and let me hit the light here real quick. It's dark. It's getting dark.
You wouldn't think so, but I actually have like 3 lights on right now, and this is as bright as it gets. So.
Yeah. There's a cool view outside of here. If you see this next to a big window of downtown Portland.
Oh, nice.
Not my apartment. I'm in my girlfriend's place. It's her stripper pole.
Making the most of it.
Yeah, it's a good place to hide out. Did your tastes when you were a kid, have you maintained those tastes? Like, is Garcia Lopez and Arthur Adams still like your go-to guys?
Um, yeah, I'd say largely. I mean, and kind of, a lot of the guys that kind of came from the Art Adams, Michael Golden type school.
Mhm.
The original Image guys, like they were huge for me. I was 10 when Image started, and like I was already reading, X-Men and X-Force and Spider-Man, and making the transition to Spawn and Wildcats and all that was just like a huge, it's just like almost that sports mentality of like sports fans where it's like it feels like your team's winning, and you vicariously feel like you're winning kind of through that. And it was just like such a massive time in comics, in my little 10-year-old mind. I was so convinced that I was going to be up there with those guys.
Yeah,
Um,
I need to. I think about that a lot. About like if I Simon Roy used to give me shit because at one point we found out what the original Dan Panosian, who's a fantastic artist who did a book called Slots recently at Image. He was the original
yeah,
artist. I think
I
at one
invited him on here this weekend, but he's busy doing his own thing.
Yeah, he's fantastic. I've yet to meet him, but I used to email with him back and forth when Prophet was going on. But at some point, me and Simon Roy found out what he was getting for the original Prophet, and it was like cartoonishly more than we paid for the Prophet we did, just because sales then and now. And yeah, the idea of like when Image was coming, because I was as a teenager when Image comics were first coming out, and I can't even. It's like the company is such a totally different animal now than it was then.
Yeah,
Um, I've got to interact with all the founders, I think, except for Jim Lee now. It's been really fascinating kind of hearing their takes on it. Um,
I've had the pleasure of meeting Jim a couple of times. I actually had to go to a screening of Superman Returns with him back in like 2006.
oh, interesting. Huh. So that's bizarre. Yeah, I guess I always forget he's tied to DC these days. Um, I I got lunch with Jim Valentino a couple months back, and he was telling me he's a really fascinating. Do you know much about his history in comics?
Well, a little bit. I mean, I first, knew him from Guardians of the Galaxy, and then Shadowhawk, and a lot of the Shadowline books are kind of among some of my favorite of the Image books that have come out.
Awesome. Yeah.
Over the last decade. So I'm familiar with him as a publisher. And
the thing that always stands out to me about him, which is really unique in all those guys, is that he came from indie, very indie comics. Like Aardvark of Anaheim published his book Normal Man, and he was kind of tied to all of the underground guys beforehand. Dean Rodriguez and all those guys, kind of that mentality before he went into Marvel and Image and all that stuff. So it's almost like he's touched every part of comics. Very fascinating. Yeah, he was telling me a bizarre story about how I don't know if you know Leonardo DiCaprio's father was tied to underground comics back then, and Valentino was telling a story about talking to I think Spain Rodriguez at a San Diego one year, and Leonardo DiCaprio was like a 10-year-old who was like pretending he was playing Star Wars or something, jumping on the hotel room bed. They're all talking. Such a weird picture. I know that sounds like vicarious name dropping through name dropping, but it's weird, just those worlds touching for me.
There was actually an interview. I don't remember who did it, but it's for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where Leonardo DiCaprio was talking about that, actually going to Comic Cons with his dad and stuff when he was a kid. And,
oh yeah,
I guess he owns quite a bit of original comic art, and a bunch of original Robert Crumb stuff. And
nice. Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah, it's always fascinating the people who the people that are like very into comics and have collections. Like there's a bunch of rappers that kind of famously have big comic collections. Method Man and Eminem are really into comics, but I always wonder if those people pay attention to what goes on these days.
yeah, It's I'm curious to see what happens with digital.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of suspect that right now there's, I mean, comics is fractured in a way where it's like you have people that read comicsology, and that's such a specific group of people that don't read web comics. Um, there was a convention up in Vancouver years ago I went to, and it was put together by a woman whose husband or boyfriend was like a web cartoonist, and so they invited people from his scene, and it was a comic convention. I knew nobody, I'd never heard of anybody's work at it, but they all had these big lines because it was all these like very kind of manga influenced American and Canadian web comics people. So it's like I think about that a lot, about how what's that book? There's a comic years ago. There was a web comic that was like the biggest thing in the world, and I think everyone was kind of baffled in comics by its existence. And I remember the name of it. It's like black and white characters that all have like neon orange horns and things like that. But yeah, I think about that a lot, about how comic. You have any idea what I'm talking about at all?
It's not ringing a bell.
I haven't read it anyway, so I don't know. But I just remembered it because I was waiting in line to see a manga artist at Emerald City years ago, and their line next to us was so much bigger, and I was like, "What is that for?" And they're like, "It's for this web comic you've never read." And so that's kind of how I think about digital. It's like it's such a different animal than going to the comic store, and it's like such a different. And, yeah, and maybe kind of like, yeah, I feel like that's kind of what's going to happen more and more in comics is, and I think it'd be a really good thing, is it kind of fracturing and becoming different things, where people that are into superhero comics and people that are into science fiction comics or indie comics almost become like, it's almost being into different scenes. Like,
Oh yeah, I was gonna say almost like a music scenes to a degree.
yeah, exactly. Like people that go to raves don't have any idea what's going on in the folk music scene and things like that.
Right. It's usually kind of only the musicians, or as it would be in comics, the artists and writers themselves that have that crossover.
You mentioned Michael Golden before. What was your kind of introduction to his work? He's someone I really find really fascinating.
Probably, I think this is Punisher covers or GI Joe, maybe GI Joe.
Yeah, he was almost pre Arthur Adams. Arthur Adams.
Yeah. He's one that I'm still kind of like going back to and discovering,
Yeah, he's definitely worth into. Yeah, because he did that GI Joe, another GI Joe annual, and the Nom was another great series. Have you read that one?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's very fascinating. Did you know he was in prison for a while?
No, I did not.
Killed a man, or at least he shot him. I don't want to tell the wrong story, but somebody said that that's why he was such a good artist, is he'd spent a lot of time alone. Hopefully the story's not as off as it could be, but I think that's the story. Yeah, and he did Bucky O'Hare, which I think they made into a cartoon.
Yes, absolutely adored that comic and the toys and the cartoon and the video game, and I still find something about a green space rabbit. It's just, and his drawings are like so cartoonily perfect. It appeals to me a great deal.
Yeah, I wonder if it's weird because there's that Michael Golden to Arthur Adams. Kind of, we were talking about Dave Stevens before. Like I feel like there's almost like a hierarchy of Dave Stevens, where it's like Dave Stevens, and you get like Adam Hughes, and then I don't know, Terry Dodson, Frank Cho, guys like that.
Yeah, I've actually got a Muse by Terry Dodson sitting right here, actually.
Oh, nice. That's fantastic. But Arthur Adams with Michael Golden is interesting because he had Arthur Adams, which is almost like the follow-up to him, and then he very much influenced Jim Lee and the early Image guys. But I wonder if there's kind of a modern version of him, maybe James Stokoe a little bit. But Stokoe is weird. I don't think he reads. Like, I feel like he just reads 2000 AD comics and Jeff Darrow.
It is jam-packed work, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It's. I was going to talk to George Pratt about it tomorrow, and I mentioned it to Greg Ruth when I was talking to him. But I think that Michael Golden and R. Adams are kind of descendants of the studio a little bit.
Oh, right. Like Barry.
Yeah, Barry Windsor Smith and Bernie Wrightson, Jeff Jones, and Mike Kaluta.
Yeah. I used to run into Kaluta a lot. It was really nice. When I was in my very early 20s, I would go to conventions, and he was like one of the nicest people to me when nobody cared about my work, which I really appreciated. Some friends of mine sat next to him at a convention. There's this guy, Rick Spears and Rob G, that did this comic called Teenagers from Mars years ago. And they were like 110 pound, just like scrawny 20-year-olds when they met him. And they sat next to Kaluta, and he like pats his Santa Claus belly and looks over him, and it's like, I can see you guys are new.
Yeah, part of a couple of groups, Dave Stevens groups and Jeffrey Jones groups and stuff that Mike boasts on sometimes. He's always got something funny to say usually.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, he's like one of those people that kind of amazes me that he exists in the same time as us, if that makes sense. Like, he's such a fantastic illustrator and cartoonist. He told me a great story about Von Baudet built a light board for him, and it was like the bulb in it was too bright, and so he could use it for a little bit, and the plastic on top of it would slowly melt, and then he'd have to turn off the light, bend it back. And it was like, such a tactile story for somebody whose work feels like they went to fucking Narnia,
That's such a great way to put it too. It has such a magical Victorian quality to it.
Yeah, him as a person too. Like, he has these like wizard eyebrows. It's like hard to believe he's a real human being. It's pretty fantastic. Yeah, but I think you're right, especially especially Barry Windsor Smith kind of being a pre-Michael Golden Arthur Adams. And he still exists somewhere too, although I don't know what he's up to.
Supposedly he's got a jazz album that's going to come out sometime soon.
Not what I expected.
But I really don't have that from like any kind of official source. That's just been the rumor.
Oh, that is a fact. That is that's a nice rumor. If anyone spreads any rumors about me, I very much like it to be about it that I have a jazz album on the way.
But yeah, I kind of consider George Pratt, Kent Williams, John J. Muth, and Mark Chiarello to be like the Studio 2.0 in a way of the 80s.
Yeah, put Sienkiewicz in there.
Yeah, Sienkiewicz would have to be in there as well. But I guess the difference being is that I think the four of those guys all, if not lived together, they were going to school kind of around the same time, the same school, and did have a shared studio space. I don't know that Sienkiewicz was ever
actually physically tied to them.
Physically tied to them.
Yeah, I've been really fascinated with the Atlanta scene too, like the kind of
Gaijin.
Yeah, and like I'm kind of loose on who was in Gaijin, but it's like I guess Mark Silvestri and Adam Hughes and like Jason Pearson and all those guys. These like just amazingly technical creators that somehow, like, I don't even mean this in a bad way, but I'm kind of fascinated. They don't have like, most of them don't have like a seminal work. Like, there's no kind of Watchmen out of the Atlanta scene, and I don't know why. I don't know if it's
that is interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. I would argue.
There's that. Is it Lunar did the book? Is it called Low End or something? Rico Renzi on
Loose Ends.
Loose Ends, that's it. Because that is a fantastic book, and it's one of those ones that I think I don't know why it's not held in higher regard. Maybe it is. I don't know, but I'm always surprised because I feel like that's the kind of Atlanta style book that I think of that is kind of the probably most impressive to me.
No, that is a great book, and I like all that stuff that Still Freeze and the 12 gauge guys and the
Yeah.
I've always found that to be pretty attractive looking comics. Um,
Yeah, Stelfreeze is such a fascinating artist.
Dave Johnson.
Yeah, yeah. I got to talk to Stelfreeze once at a comic convention, and he told me a story about when he was really young, getting brought to Tokyo and meeting Osamu Tezuka, and being there alone with Will Eisner and his wife, and how bizarre it was for him to be like a young guy in his early 20s, that the only other person that spoke English next to him was Eisner. Very
Well, I mean, it's not not bad company to be in, I suppose, in that situation.
yeah, yeah, it's interesting. Um, yeah, I'm surprised that there's not more. I don't know. It's always interesting what people get out of comics too, because um, like that scene, the Atlanta scene seems so um, technical competency based, and there's so many other parts of comics that seem so much more just like like up in Seattle, there's like kind of Fantagraphics crew, which just like Simon Hanselman these days, but how it's like kind of the opposite side of the coin about that. It's just more about like kind of having fun, even though it's like like Hanselman, for instance, I think is like super capable of doing very pretty work, but it seems like his audience just wants like kind of weed jokes. I mean, that's what he likes to do too.
Mm. That is a interesting kind of dichotomy, and I've been kind of fortunate to get to straddle the line between both a little bit, I guess, at various points throughout my career. My first published work when I was 16 is a fanzine called The Launchpad, and I did kind of like this joke rip-off strip of Milk and Cheese called Soap and Shampoo.
Nice.
It was all about like them kind of killing copies of other character rip-off copies of other characters, kind of the image, making fun of the image thing a little bit, and at the very end, off panel, Soap and Shampoo or Milk and Cheese come and kill them.
That's fantastic. I had a very brief meeting with Evan Dorkin once at a comic book editor's house in New Jersey, and I kind of worked up the nerve to walk up to him and say to him like, "Oh, I really like your work," and he just goes, "I don't," and he walked away.
Actually, before I had drawn the last page, I had wanted, just for that one panel for actual Milk and Cheese to show up. And back in the days of, I guess it'd have been early Yahoo or whatever, I looked up his phone number and called him one afternoon, explained who I was and what I wanted to do. And he said, "Thank you for asking, but no, I'm not interested in that." And the next year, ever, I met him in Chicago and showed it to him, and he's like, "Oh, I wish you would have showed me. I would have let you do it."
Yeah, it's too bad. I think it becomes kind of wearing sometimes. If I definitely had that experience where you're just kind of in the middle of working and you get an email for someone's like, "Let's talk about a film," and you're like, "I can't right now," and then later on, "Oh, that would have been cool." My head was not in that space right then.
Well, I appreciate you making the time and talking and sharing some headspace with me. And
I got nothing else to do. Just me alone with this pole. I got to work on my dancing.
we told you the comic industry was changing, folks. It starts right here. Yeah. So, do you want to plug? Do you have stuff available on Comixology or digitally anywhere that people can
Oh, sure.
download? Or?
I mean, if people haven't read Prophet or King City or Multiple Warhead, I'm sure they can find it very easily on the internet. Yeah, and I imagine things are kind of mail order happening these days. Yeah, it's interesting. I've been kind of off shelves for so long. I was kind of, as I was planning my new book to come out, I was like, how's this gonna sell? And now it's like, I imagine the game has kind of changed, and it's like, how is anything gonna sell? But Google is certainly an option, and yeah, imagine if people are watching this, they're either very bored or know my work already.
Yeah, that's true. Now on that note, I'm gonna let you go.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
This girl needs to go out and do her doggy business. So
Dog's name.
This is Zephyr.
Zephyr. Excellent.
Yeah, then we got Lilu's around here somewhere.
Oh, cool. Like Fifth Element, Lilu?
Yeah.
Okay. I will let you take your dog out. Oh, yeah. Thanks a lot for talking to me on here. It's been fun.
I'll message you about doing a follow-up. If not this weekend, it looks like I'll probably be continuing this for a while. We can get you and Simon and Farrell and whoever to
drag on. That'll be fun.
To do a panel. So I didn't want to get too overwhelmed with, just this is my first day doing this. So I've been trying to keep it kind of simple. But
cool.
Again, yeah. Thank you so very much, and wishing the very best to you and everyone over there in Portland. And
I hope everybody gets through this okay. But yeah, really good talking to you.
Yeah, you too, Brandon. Take care. You have a good night.
You too.